It was a late autumn day in Anne Arundel County, Maryland, in November of 1969, the kind of evening where the chill bites through layers of clothing, and the wind moves through quiet suburban streets carrying the subtle rustle of falling leaves. For most residents, life followed its familiar rhythm. Families preparing dinner in tidy homes, shopkeepers closing for the night, children returning from school in the fading daylight. But on Friday, November 7th, the ordinary fractured in an instant. That day, Joyce Helen Malecki, a 20-year-old nun and teacher, disappeared without a trace, leaving behind a life carefully lived and a mystery that would linger unresolved for decades. Before diving in, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated on our latest cold case stories. Joyce was not merely another young woman in a quiet community. She was someone who had dedicated herself to faith and service. She had entered religious life at a young age, embracing the strict routines and responsibilities of her order while also pursuing her calling to educate. Those who knew her described Joyce as gentle yet determined, thoughtful, and quietly confident. A person who inspired trust and goodwill in both her peers and her students. Her days were structured, predictable, and devoted. Mornings spent in prayer and study, afternoons teaching, evenings in reflection or completing errands. It was a rhythm that, to those around her, seemed unshakable. The late 1960s in Anne Arundel County were a unique mixture of suburban calm and the subtle tensions of a society in transition. The area was growing rapidly, filled with young families, schools adjusting to accommodate the baby boom, and a community that prided itself on familiarity and neighborly watchfulness. Yet, even in a town where neighbors knew each other's routines and most doors were left unlocked, the disappearance of a young woman, particularly one devoted to a religious life, sent shockwaves that were impossible to ignore. It was not just that Joyce had vanished. It was that someone so careful, so connected to her community, could simply be gone without warning. On the afternoon of November 7th, Joyce left her convent dormitory for what was expected to be a routine outing. Records indicate she visited a shopping area near what is believed to have been Harundale Mall, carrying out errands as she often did. She was reportedly planning to meet someone later that evening, though the specifics of that meeting remain uncertain, clouded by the passage of time and the limited documentation available. Joyce's disappearance was first noticed when she failed to return to her dormitory at the expected time. Her absence was unusual enough to raise immediate concern among her fellow sisters, who quickly realized that something was wrong. In the hours following her disappearance, the concern escalated into alarm. Joyce's personal belongings, including her car, were left behind under circumstances that offered no clear explanation. Her car was later found abandoned, keys still inside, signaling that whatever had happened, it had occurred abruptly. The small cues of her daily life, the sound of her voice, her familiar presence in classrooms, the ordinary movements she performed each day, vanished, replaced by an unsettling silence that blanketed the convent and surrounding community. The initial search efforts were swift but frustrating. Local authorities combed nearby streets and neighborhoods, while her family and fellow sisters spread out to check areas Joyce might have visited. Despite their efforts, no immediate clues emerged. The sense of unease that had begun as worry turned quickly to dread. Investigators noted the lack of witnesses who could confirm her movements after she left the shopping area, and the trail seemed to evaporate into the November dusk. Joyce's disappearance was not only a personal tragedy, but also a challenge to the broader sense of security in the community. In a town where routines were trusted and people were familiar with one another, the fact that a young woman could vanish without a trace raised uncomfortable questions about safety, oversight, and the unknown dangers that might lurk in otherwise ordinary places. It highlighted the fragility of life in a world that often seemed orderly and predictable. Her case quickly drew the attention of law enforcement beyond the local level. The proximity of Fort Meade, a federal installation nearby, meant that the FBI became involved early in the investigation, providing additional resources and jurisdictional reach that local authorities alone could not provide. But even with these additional investigative bodies, the search yielded little tangible evidence. Joyce's disappearance remained a blank canvas, with only fragments of her last day offering faint outlines of what had occurred. The weeks that followed were marked by mounting concern and unanswered questions. Community members and the family of Joyce Helen Malecki grappled with a growing fear that something irreversible had happened. Each day that passed without word or sighting seemed to widen the gap between the world she had lived in and the one she had suddenly disappeared into. The once familiar streets, shops, and classrooms she had inhabited now became haunting reminders of absence, ordinary places rendered eerie by what was missing. Joyce's life, so carefully structured around service, teaching, and faith, left behind a stark contrast to the sudden chaos of her disappearance. The tension between her predictable existence and the uncertainty of her fate became the core of the mystery. How could someone so connected to community and routine simply vanish? And more urgently, who, if anyone, could answer that question? Even decades later, the questions that began that November afternoon remain compelling. How does someone disappear in a community where everyone knows everyone? How could life so carefully lived leave behind so few clues? The weeks following her disappearance would see the community and authorities mobilized in search of answers, combing streets, questioning witnesses, and chasing the faintest hints of her presence. Yet each day seemed to deepen the mystery, as if the ordinary world Joyce had inhabited had been suddenly rewritten in shadows. And then, just as hope flickered amid the uncertainty, a grim reality would begin to emerge, a discovery that would shatter expectations, confirm fears, and mark the beginning of an investigation that would stretch across decades. The silence that had settled over Maryland in the days after her disappearance was about to be broken, and the story of Joyce Helen Malecki would take its next harrowing turn. On Friday, November 7, 1969, Joyce Helen Malecki left the quiet confines of her convent dormitory for what was expected to be a routine afternoon. The day was overcast, with a brisk chill in the air, hinting at the approach of winter. Joyce moved through the streets of Anne Arundel County with the calm purpose that defined her life, visiting a shopping area near Harundale Mall, attending to errands she had likely performed many times before. Witness recollections are sparse, and while the exact sequence of events remains partially obscured by time, it is clear that she carried herself with her characteristic composure. When Joyce failed to return to her dormitory that evening, concern escalated rapidly. Her fellow sisters attempted to contact her and retrace the paths she normally took, but no response came. This absence was uncharacteristic. Joyce's routine was highly predictable, and the sudden void she left behind immediately alarmed those who knew her best. By nightfall, it became evident that a serious situation had unfolded. Joyce's car was discovered abandoned shortly afterward, parked in a nearby lot with the keys still inside. This detail, mundane in isolation, now became one of the first concrete clues signaling that her disappearance was abrupt and unplanned. Investigators noted that there was no evidence suggesting she had intended to leave or that she had voluntarily gone missing. This abruptness intensified the community's growing unease. Local law enforcement mobilized quickly, canvassing the area surrounding Harundale Mall and questioning anyone who might have seen Joyce that afternoon. Neighbors were interviewed, and all familiar routes she might have taken were checked. Yet each lead yielded little beyond fleeting observations. An unidentified figure in a parking lot, a brief sighting at a corner store, and the faint possibility that she had encountered someone while on her errands. Despite these exhaustive efforts, nothing provided clarity, and the initial hours of the investigation were marked by mounting frustration and uncertainty. The proximity of Fort Meade meant that the FBI became involved early, adding federal investigative resources to the search. Yet, even with additional manpower and expertise, Joyce's disappearance appeared total. Her presence had seemingly vanished from a community that otherwise functioned under predictable patterns. The ordinary streets, homes, and shops she moved through daily suddenly felt alien, filled with a silence that magnified the gravity of the situation. As days turned into weeks, search efforts expanded dramatically. Ground teams combed nearby wooded areas, streams, and fields. Flyers were distributed to neighboring towns in an attempt to generate new leads, while community volunteers coordinated local searches, desperately hoping to uncover even a small clue. Her family, stricken with fear, joined in the searches, often enduring long, cold days as hope battled against mounting dread. Her fellow sisters organized vigils and offered prayers, their faith now intertwined with anxiety as they confronted the terrifying reality that one of their own was missing. Despite the persistence of these efforts, the trail remained elusive, leaving only the growing weight of uncertainty. Nearly 2 months after she vanished, on January 3, 1970, Joyce's body was discovered near Lansdowne, Maryland, in a wooded area close to the Little Patuxent River. The location had been searched previously but yielded no findings at the time. She was found face down in shallow water, partially clothed. Reports indicated signs of strangulation and stabbing, though details regarding the precise nature of her injuries remain limited in public records, reflecting both the sensitivity of the case and investigative protocols of the period. The discovery confirmed the fears that had silently haunted her family, sisters, and the broader community. Joyce had not simply disappeared, she had been murdered. The wooded, river-adjacent location had complicated earlier searches. Dense vegetation, uneven terrain, and winter conditions contributed to the delay in discovery, underscoring the challenges investigators faced even with a concentrated effort. Jurisdictional complexity added another layer of difficulty, as local, state, and federal authorities all held partial investigative responsibility due to the proximity of Fort Meade. News of Joyce's murder sent shockwaves throughout Anne Arundel County and neighboring communities. Coverage in local newspapers was limited, partly due to her religious affiliation, yet the underlying truth was clear. Someone had committed a violent act against a young woman in a town that had considered itself safe. Friends and family described their grief as profound and unrelenting. The sisters who had watched over her daily routine were left grappling with a mixture of sorrow, guilt, and unanswered questions, while her family confronted a nightmare that had taken tangible form only weeks after the initial disappearance. The immediate investigation following the discovery focused on reconstructing her last known movements, gathering physical evidence, and interviewing witnesses anew. Authorities attempted to create a coherent timeline, but progress was slow. Early leads dissolved under scrutiny, and for each potential clue that surfaced, more questions seemed to follow. Family members expressed frustration with the limits of the investigation, while law enforcement acknowledged the difficulty of pursuing a case with minimal initial evidence and the complexity added by overlapping jurisdictions. Even after her body was recovered, the haunting sense of uncertainty persisted. Ordinary life in Anne Arundel County, once predictable and secure, now bore the weight of a violent and unresolved tragedy. Joyce's carefully structured life, devoted to faith, teaching, and service, had abruptly ended, leaving behind a void of grief, confusion, and unanswered questions. The sequence of her final days, the abandoned car, the meticulous searches, and the eventual discovery of her body together form a portrait of both a life interrupted and a community unsettled. Each detail invites reflection, demanding that investigators, historians, and the public consider whether subtle clues or overlooked facts might still hold the key to understanding the events of that November day. Could the choices made during those first critical hours, the overlooked evidence, or small details from her routine hold answers that remain hidden to this day? Though the immediate search ended in discovery, the path to justice and understanding has remained unresolved, compelling future investigators and observers to continue seeking the truth behind the disappearance and murder of Joyce Helen Malecki. From the moment Joyce Helen Malecki's body was discovered near the Little Patuxent River in January 1970, investigators faced a labyrinth of challenges. Local police, augmented by state authorities and the FBI due to the proximity of Fort Meade, quickly began assembling the pieces of a case that had already grown cold by the time her body was found. Each step was a meticulous attempt to reconstruct a life suddenly interrupted, but the path was complicated by the passage of weeks, incomplete eyewitness accounts, and the natural erasure of evidence by time and environment. Investigators first focused on Joyce's last confirmed movements. They retraced her steps from the convent dormitory to the shopping area near Harundale Mall, attempting to establish a precise timeline for her disappearance. Witnesses were interviewed repeatedly, but few could provide concrete details. Some recalled seeing a young woman matching Joyce's description carrying parcels or walking alone, while others noted an unfamiliar figure in the parking lot. Nothing could be confirmed with certainty, and the fragmentary nature of these accounts left detectives with only a skeletal framework upon which to build their investigation. The abandoned car, left with the keys inside, became a central point of inquiry. Forensic analysis at the time was limited, and while authorities examined the vehicle for signs of foul play or physical evidence, the technology of 1970 offered little beyond observational clues. Fingerprints, if present, were difficult to extract, and any potential trace evidence had likely degraded in the weeks since her disappearance. Still, investigators documented every detail: the placement of the keys, the absence of forced entry, and the surrounding environment. At the crime scene where her body was ultimately found, photographs were taken, personal effects were collected, and her clothing was carefully preserved for further examination, all of which became critical points of reference in the ongoing investigation, even as they failed to immediately produce leads. Joyce's family and fellow sisters played a pivotal role in supporting the investigation. They provided context about her routines, habits, and acquaintances, essential information in narrowing potential leads. The sisters spoke to detectives about Joyce's daily schedule, her preferred routes, and her interactions with students and community members. Family members attempted to piece together her social circle, reaching out to friends and acquaintances to understand if there had been any unusual encounters or threats in the weeks prior to her disappearance. Investigators examined anyone she had frequent contact with, including co-workers and acquaintances from her religious community, though no formal charges were ever filed. These efforts reflected not only grief, but also determination to contribute to the search for justice. Despite these early efforts, investigators encountered significant obstacles. The area where Joyce's body was discovered had been previously searched, and natural factors had likely concealed key evidence. Dense vegetation along the Little Patuxent River, uneven terrain, and winter conditions complicated recovery and examination of potential clues. Jurisdictional overlap between local, state, and federal authorities sometimes slowed communication and complicated decision-making, creating gaps that could not easily be bridged. Public reporting of the case offered its own set of challenges. Newspapers in the region acknowledged the disappearance and later the discovery, but details were often limited due to Joyce's religious affiliation and the sensitive nature of the circumstances. Consequently, the broader community was aware of the tragedy, yet specifics that might have prompted public tips or additional witnesses were scarce. Investigators relied heavily on the information collected directly from witnesses, family members, and early responders. During this initial phase, investigators considered potential suspects or persons of interest, though public records make it clear that no arrests were made and no charges filed. Early interviews included individuals Joyce had interacted with in her teaching capacity and within her religious order, as well as people she may have encountered during her errands. Each account was carefully evaluated for inconsistencies or suspicious behavior, but for years, every promising lead ended in frustration. Nothing definitively connected any individual to the crime scene, leaving the case unresolved even as detectives labored tirelessly to follow every thread. Forensic limitations of the time further constrained the investigation. In 1970, DNA analysis was not yet available, and fingerprint recovery, trace evidence collection, and other modern techniques were in their infancy. Investigators relied primarily on witness statements, circumstantial evidence, and detailed documentation of the crime scene. While these methods were diligent, the lack of technological support made solving the case exponentially more difficult. Each piece of evidence, from the positioning of Joyce's body to the condition of her clothing and personal effects, was meticulously recorded, yet no conclusive path forward emerged. Throughout the early weeks and months, the community watched and waited, aware that a young woman had been violently taken from their midst. Family members remained engaged, pressing for updates and maintaining hope that someone, somewhere, might hold the key to solving the mystery. The Sisters of Joyce's Order, while grieving, also offered support to investigators, providing insight into her character and daily life, hoping that understanding her habits and personality might illuminate clues missed in the initial search. Despite the tireless work of investigators, the case gradually transitioned into a frustrating limbo. Each lead, no matter how promising, seemed to dissolve under scrutiny. Eyewitnesses' memories were inconsistent, physical evidence was limited, and the intricate dynamics of Joyce's social and religious circles offered few clear avenues. For years, detectives would revisit the case periodically, hoping that fresh eyes or newly emerging evidence might break the stalemate. Yet for decades, the truth remained elusive, and the community's unanswered questions only deepened. Even now, the investigation into Joyce Helen Malecki's disappearance and murder underscores the profound challenges faced by law enforcement when confronted with limited evidence, overlapping jurisdictions, and the constraints of technology at the time. The painstaking efforts of those early investigators laid the groundwork for all subsequent inquiries. Yet the gaps left by time and circumstance have made the pursuit of justice a slow and ongoing endeavor. In the decades to follow, renewed searches, media attention, and modern forensic techniques would provide hope that new leads might emerge, keeping the case alive in the public consciousness. Could the key to understanding what truly happened lie hidden in small, overlooked details from those first weeks? Were there witnesses who never came forward, clues lost in plain sight, or opportunities to connect the threads that were missed? For years, each promising lead ended the same way, nowhere, leaving behind only the determination of detectives, the grief of family, and the enduring mystery of a young life taken too soon. As the 1970s progressed, the case of Joyce Helen Malecki remained unsolved, lingering as a shadow over Anne Arundel County. Despite the tireless efforts of early investigators, every lead that had initially surfaced seemed to dissolve into the ether, leaving her family, sisters, and law enforcement with a profound sense of frustration. Yet the story of Joyce's life, disappearance, and tragic death refused to fade entirely, and over the decades, moments of renewed hope would punctuate the long silence. Investigators periodically revisited the case, reassessing the limited evidence collected in 1970 with fresh eyes. Photographs from the scene, clothing preserved for examination, and witness statements were reviewed repeatedly, sometimes revealing minor details previously overlooked. While forensic science of the early 1970s constrained immediate progress, the careful documentation preserved by detectives became invaluable for future inquiries. Each re-examination reflected a persistent belief among those working the case that a breakthrough was still possible, even after years of inactivity. Media attention played a significant role in keeping Joyce's story alive. Local newspapers, including the Anne Arundel County Gazette and other regional publications, occasionally published retrospectives on the disappearance, highlighting both the enduring mystery and the grief of her family and religious community. In an era before widespread digital communication, these reports were essential in maintaining public awareness. They reminded the community that the case had not been forgotten and occasionally prompted tips, though few ever led to concrete leads. Each new article, each public mention of Joyce's name, rekindled hope that someone with knowledge of the crime might come forward. Tip lines and public inquiries became a crucial avenue for investigators, even decades after the murder. Authorities encouraged anyone with information, however seemingly insignificant, to report it. While most tips proved to be dead ends or anecdotal, The process kept lines of communication open between the community and law enforcement. The sustained effort reflected a broader recognition that cold cases often yield results only when persistence intersects with new perspectives or information. The advent of modern forensic techniques offered renewed possibilities. By the 1980s and 1990s, the introduction of DNA analysis and more sophisticated crime scene processing provided hope that evidence preserved from 1970 could finally reveal something definitive. While it is not publicly documented whether DNA testing was ever performed on Joyce's preserved clothing or other materials, the very existence of these preserved items allowed for the potential application of modern science in the investigation. Cold case units, trained in revisiting decades-old files, recognized that even small details could become pivotal when reassessed with contemporary methods. Throughout these decades, the community's memory of Joyce and the tragedy that befell her never faded. Friends, family members, and fellow sisters maintained their advocacy, sometimes urging law enforcement to continue probing the case or to release additional information to the public. This enduring attention ensured that Joyce's story remained in the collective consciousness, a constant reminder that the search for justice is ongoing, even when immediate solutions are elusive. Yet, despite these renewed efforts, the case remained frustratingly resistant to closure. Investigators encountered familiar obstacles: witnesses whose memories had dimmed over time, evidence degraded by decades, and potential leads that could not be substantiated. Each attempt to break the case open underscored the difficulties inherent in investigating crimes committed long ago, where even the smallest oversight or delay can obscure the path to truth. The persistence of investigators kept the case alive, but the lack of resolution remained a haunting reality. Still, moments of optimism punctuated the long stretches of uncertainty. The mere fact that the case continued to receive attention from law enforcement and the public alike created the possibility that new information, previously unreported or overlooked, might surface. Every tip-line call, media article, or re-examination of preserved evidence carried with it the potential to illuminate what had remained hidden for so long. Could the key to solving the case be hidden in the documents, the archived photographs, or the memories of someone who witnessed a fragment of that day? Might advances in forensic science one day provide clarity where human recollection and early investigative tools could not? Despite these decades of dead ends and tentative hope, the case remained unresolved, compelling law enforcement, family, and the community to continue probing the mystery. Through decades of careful review, renewed searches, and persistent public attention, the story of Joyce Helen Malecki stands as a testament to resilience, the limits of time, and the unwavering pursuit of answers. Each reopened file, each reassessed piece of evidence, and each renewed tip keeps the possibility of resolution alive. The unresolved nature of the case, combined with the ongoing dedication of those who refuse to abandon it, naturally leads to the lingering questions, theories, and investigative reflections that continue to surround this tragic story. Even after all these years, Joyce's story demonstrates that cold cases are never truly closed when memory endures, when communities maintain vigilance, and when investigators refuse to abandon the search. The pursuit of truth continues, leaving open the possibility that one day the fragments of this decades-old mystery may finally be connected, revealing answers that have remained just out of reach. The renewed attention brought by the keepers did something no cold case file could. It humanized Joyce Malecki again. Her name wasn't just a line in a report, it was spoken aloud by millions of viewers, some of whom had lived through those years in Baltimore and remembered the fear that once gripped the community. Old friends, neighbors, and even former investigators began to speak up, sharing pieces of memory long stored away. Yet, for all the renewed focus, the mystery surrounding Joyce's final hours only deepened. The official record remains painfully thin. What is known is that Joyce left her home in Glen Burnie on November 7, 1969, planning to buy her brother a birthday gift at the Harundale Mall. She never returned. 2 days later, her car was found abandoned near the same area, and days after that, Her body surfaced near Fort Meade, in a wooded section beside the Little Patuxent River. The cause of death was determined to be strangulation and stabbing. Her watch and some personal items were missing. Police believed she was killed elsewhere, and her body dumped in the secluded area. For decades, those few facts were all investigators could cling to. But when journalists and survivors of abuse from the nearby Archbishop Keogh High School began connecting dots, questions surfaced that the public had never been encouraged to ask. Around the same time, Joyce disappeared. Another young woman named Catherine Cesnik, a beloved nun and teacher at Keogh, vanished from Baltimore. Her body would be discovered 2 months later, on January 3, 1970, the same day Joyce Malecki's remains were found. The parallels were unsettling. 2 women with Catholic ties, murdered within weeks of each other, their bodies discarded near water, both cases unsolved. Investigators have never formally linked the 2 murders, but some who've studied both cases believe it's impossible to ignore the overlap. In later years, several former Keogh students came forward alleging that a priest named Joseph Maskell, who served as the school's chaplain, had sexually abused them during the late 1960s. According to some survivors, Sister Cathy Cesnik may have discovered what was happening and planned to report it. They believe she was silenced before she could act. The theory that Joyce Malecki might have crossed paths with the same circle of people, perhaps unintentionally, has circulated for decades but remains unproven. Federal investigators have reviewed these claims multiple times, even exhuming Maskell's body in 2017 for DNA comparison. The results did not match any evidence found on either Cesnik or Malecki. The case files show that police also explored alternative possibilities: strangers, military personnel stationed near Fort Meade, and even transient laborers who passed through the area. Each line of inquiry eventually collapsed under the weight of time, incomplete records, or vanished witnesses. One retired detective later admitted that in 1969, communication between jurisdictions was poor, and evidence handling was far from modern standards. It's unclear how much physical evidence still exists today. The FBI has confirmed that both cases remain technically open but dormant unless new leads emerge. A spokesperson once summarized the frustration succinctly: "We know what happened to these women. We just don't know who did it." Some have theorized that Joyce may have been the victim of an opportunistic predator, someone who noticed her alone in the parking lot and acted on impulse. Others suspect a more deliberate act, one tied to the same network of secrecy and fear that has haunted the Keogh narrative for decades. But every theory ends where the evidence does, in silence. Even so, it's a silence that continues to demand attention. In Anne Arundel County, Joyce's family carried the loss quietly for years. Her parents died without answers. Her siblings have since spoken rarely, except to say that Joyce was deeply kind, independent, and close to her family. To them, she wasn't a symbol in a broader scandal. She was their sister, who left home one afternoon and never came back. In interviews decades later, one relative said simply, "We just want her remembered for who she was, not for the questions we'll never stop asking." The landscape where her body was found has changed. The wooded stretch near Fort Meade has been partially developed, the quiet fields now interrupted by new roads and fences. But somewhere beneath the layers of time, the place still carries the weight of what happened there. Locals who know the history say that every so often, flowers appear by the roadside, left by someone who refuses to let Joyce's name be forgotten. Cases like this remind us that justice can be elusive, even when it feels close enough to touch. The files are yellowed, the memories faded, and yet the truth is still out there, buried in someone's recollection, hidden in an old document, or waiting in a piece of evidence that technology hasn't yet unlocked. It's what makes unsolved stories so haunting. They live on in possibility. Could the answer to Joyce Malecki's murder still lie in the space between those 2 cases, the nun and the young woman who never came home? Or has time scattered the clues beyond recovery? For now, what endures is memory, the renewed investigations, the survivors who spoke up, and the voices that refused to let these women disappear twice, once in life and again in silence. Their courage reshaped how the public remembers Baltimore's darker history. And for Joyce, whose story began on a quiet November afternoon in 1969, that remembrance may yet lead to truth. Even after all these years, someone out there knows what happened. And maybe, one day, they'll come forward. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the search for justice and the untold stories behind each case. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow more revealed crime stories, and we'll see you in the next one.